Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on History Byte podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Jonathan Reed. Jonathan Reed is a leading authority on the archaeology of early Christianity and has worked on archaeological excavations and conducted research in Israel, Greece, and Rome. He has authored, co-authored, and edited 6 books, including Excavating Jesus with John Dominic Crossan, which has been translated into 6 languages. His early scholarship focused on understanding Jesus' sayings within their first century Jewish and Roman imperial context. More recently, he has been examining the study of Native American religions, with a particular focus on the Lakota ghost dance and the adaptability of indigenous religions to a modern context. So welcome to the History Vibe podcast, Jonathan Reed.
Great, thank you. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Big fan.
Well, thank you. And likewise, I'm a big fan of you, and thank you for joining me. And this is the book, everybody, What Archaeology Reveals About the First Christians. And I have the link to purchase it in the description below and in the pinned comment, the affiliate link to go purchase it. All right, let's get right into it. What is the earliest known archaeological evidence for Christianity?
If you're talking about what Christians have produced, that comes a little bit later in the 2nd century. Includes a variety of things. Most of it is symbolic. The fish, for example, but we can't really be sure. Are all fishes Christian? Probably not. Are some? Maybe. We also have actually gospel texts, papyri, Christian documents that might date as early as the late 2nd century, that I'm sure many of your viewers are familiar with. Consider that also archaeological evidence, but really not a whole lot until the late 2nd and then finally the 3rd century, when you start to have things like inscriptions and a little bit more clarity, even possibly some buildings or items that are used as churches. In my opinion, actually, the probably the earliest evidence for Christians is anti-Christian. It's a graffiti in Rome on the Palatine Hill of a cross, and it's a donkey crucified to a cross, and somebody's making fun of a man named Alexamenos, and it says Alexamenos worships his donkey, worships his ass, and it's a picture of a Christian worshiping again, a donkey. So it's kind of odd that the earliest depiction of a cross and the earliest really evidence for Christians is anti-Christian.
What can archaeology tell us about early Christianity that the text cannot?
I think the most important thing, it used to be called background. I don't really like that word. I like to think of it more, archaeology more as foreground. But archaeology tells us a lot about the real world in which these texts were written, in which the authors lived, in which the first audience was familiar with. And it helps us kind of fill out what was happening. The gospel texts, Paul's letters, they create kind of a world of literature. But we need to connect that, if we want to understand it, to the real world. We can do that through other texts, but those other texts, be they Greek or Roman, or other religions, pagan, Jewish, those are also constructed worlds. And so I think archaeology does a great job of helping us understand the world in which the texts were written.
What does interpretive archaeology mean?
That's a good question. And various anthropologists, archaeologists would use different terms for it. In my book, I talk about the 3 different kinds of archaeology. You have field archaeology, which is going out and getting the stuff, and that requires rigorous discipline, organization, hard work. There's then analytical archaeology, which takes a look at the artifacts that are found, examines them, maybe does chemical analysis, tries to do studies on them. The most important for that is ceramics, pottery, what we call the sine qua non of archaeology, without which there is none, because that helps us date things. The third area that archaeologists work on is interpretive archaeology. And interpretive archaeology is extremely important. And I'm going to have to stop you here. There's a huge helicopter going overhead. Can you hear
No
that?
problem. I can hear it.
Um,
I can edit this part out. It's
okay,
fine.
yeah, it's
Let's just wait.
we've had some fires, so they're hauling people up there about every 3 hours. So this shouldn't happen again. Uh,
Okay.
but even if I'm inside, actually, you'd still hear it.
Oh yeah, I believe it. Okay. Uh, did you finish your answer to that question,
No, I didn't
or?
really get to interpretive archaeology. Do you want me to just kind of start from
Yeah,
there?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Another important thing that archaeologists do is interpretive archaeology, and that's basically looking at all the field research, taking a look at all the analysis that's been done, and putting it together into an interpretation of key questions, an interpretation that reconstructs the world, that asks key questions, maybe how rich were the rich, how many were there, how poor were the poor, how many were there, what was life like for the average person, how different was it from the rich? And of course, there's a series of other questions that can be asked in terms of how people lived or how people died.
Can archaeology confirm the New Testament?
Well, I'm gonna say categorically no. It can't confirm the key truth claims of the New Testament. It can't confirm that Jesus was divine. It can't confirm that Jesus healed people. It can't confirm that Jesus resurrected. Can't confirm that the good news was really good news, and that you'll go to heaven. All of that it can't confirm. What archaeology, I guess, could confirm, if you want to use that word, is that some of the historical figures mentioned in the New Testament did exist, notably Pontius Pilate, who's involved in the crucifixion. We know about him through historical resources, including an archaeological inscription that's been found. We also have an ossuary of Caiaphas, the high priest, who was involved in the arrest and or the trial of Jesus, and maybe I can share a picture of that if that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, and here we go. This is a ossuary or bone box. Um, it's about a third of the size of your refrigerator and would contain the bones of the deceased. In this case, you can see it's an incredibly ornate and articulate and well done artistic representation on the front. And on the left hand side, you see kind of chicken scratched the name of uh, Caiaphas, the high priest. And so, yeah, these were real people. They're mentioned in the New Testament. We have archaeological evidence for them, but that in itself doesn't really prove any of the truth claims of the New Testament.
Is the James ossuary inscription a forgery?
Well, I think me and I'd say just about all of my colleagues in archaeology and most of them in biblical scholarship think it's a forgery, overwhelmingly so. The magic words for archaeologists are in situ, Latin for in context, and that means it's been found in an excavation. So things that are found in an excavation we consider to be solid and secure, not forged. We know the context; it's really important. When something is ex situ, outside of context, hasn't been found in an archaeological context, but rather has been appears through a dealer who might have financial gain in mind, or pops up in a museum where there's issues of prestige, that casts a real shadow over things, and you're already uncertain. Some of the initial analysis of the ossuary showed that the patina, the film that develops over time on stone, had inside of it uh, small coccoliths, which were little microscopic items, which would indicate that the patina and the stone itself were different, so that somebody put the patina on the inscription to make it look authentic. Um, interestingly, uh, the owner uh, of the James ossuary had all kinds of forging equipment in his house when it was raided by Israeli authorities. Um, but also, interestingly, after a very long trial, he was not found guilty. Now, just because he wasn't found guilty doesn't mean that the ossuary is authentic. It just means that the lawyers couldn't prove that he was the one that forged it and was selling it for financial gain. Most of my colleagues overwhelmingly think it's a fake. But even let's just play that game for a second. Let's say it's real. Does it prove the New Testament? Not really. I mean, most serious historians and scholars think that Jesus existed, think that had a brother James, or half brother James, maybe a follower, early important follower. So it's remotely possible that this is a connection, but even so, it doesn't prove the truth claims of the New Testament.
What does archaeology tell us about the temple during the time of Jesus?
Well, the temple in Jerusalem is massive, and the archaeology teaches us all kinds of things about it. When you think of the ancient world and you think of the major building projects like the Colosseum or the Pantheon in Rome, you really have to realize, after looking at the archaeology, that Herod the Great's temple that he built in Jerusalem is really its equal. The temple was started by, or the new temple renovation was started by Herod the Great. It really wasn't finished. Well, it really wasn't ever finished until the temple was destroyed in 70. So it was a massive project that lasted decades. And it really teaches us a lot about the times that Herod the Great wanted to do two things. One is that he wanted to lay claim to being the king of the Jews, and he wanted the Jews, his subjects, to respect him as king of the Jews. He had a little bit of a shady past as a Idumean, and their likely forced circumcision of his parents or grandparents when they came into the Hasmonean realm. So even though he claimed to be a Jew, there was a bit of suspicion about that by many Jews. But it'd be hard to argue with the temple. He made it into one of the greatest architectural monuments in the Roman world. The second thing that he did is he made sure he was building something that would be recognized throughout the world, that would be recognized by Rome, and that would make him a player in the Eastern Mediterranean, if not the entire Roman world. But what to me is really important about the archaeology of the temple, it's not just the temple itself, but it's the entire surrounding. And one of the key aspects of that surrounding is some of the palatial mansions in which the high priests lived. And it gives a real nice indication of the connection between the temple, the high priests, their wealth, the relative poverty elsewhere in Jerusalem. And in addition to that, all of the pools around Jerusalem indicate that Herod was intent on making sure that Jews could abide by the purity laws as they came to the temple and have places to bathe, do ritual bathing before they came to the temple. So it's not just the archaeology of the temple, it's the archaeology of Jerusalem as a whole that helps you understand the context. And I do have, if we can give it a try, a couple of illustrations that I had done for a book titled Excavating Jesus. If you want to take a look at those, this is kind of what the temple would have looked like. A reconstruction done by a Hungarian artist for the book that John Dominic Crossan and I wrote. His name was Balázs Balogh. You can actually see his name at the bottom right of the corner, but you get a good sense of the grandeur of the temple here, how massive it was, the many people going up the stairs that you see over on the far right side and kind of middle right up the stairs. But what we tried to do in this book in terms of an illustration is connect the temple as a whole with the Temple Mount, and with the high priestly houses. So let me go to a second picture. Okay, so if you take a look at this, you can see in the background the Temple Mount. And this is a reconstruction of the excavations, the houses that have been excavated. We're doing actually a lot of cheating. Most of this material was from the very bottom floor. This would have been from the top floor of the house. I very much doubt the house would have had two columns and no wall. It may have had windows and curtains, but we did that for artistic effect so that you can see the connection of the high priestly dwellings with the temple itself. And of course, for a lot of people, what is most interesting about that is those houses of the priests would have looked down over the area where the markets would have been held, which exactly would have been the spot we imagine from the Gospels where Jesus would have overturned the tables. So that we know from archaeology was a very, call it a public event. And it would have been visible probably to the target, which I don't think was Jews in general, but I think was the high priesthood and the Sadducees.
I'd like to come back to the James ossuary real quick and just for clarification. So when you say that the inscription on it is forged, is it the entire inscription, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus, or just the brother of Jesus part?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, just the brother of Jesus. Yeah. So it's the latter component that is kind of the home run, the big event as it were, for people that wanted to see proof of the Gospels. Yeah, good point.
All right, thanks for that. Can you tell us a bit about the Pool of Siloam?
Yeah, there's a couple of pools that are probably worth mentioning for people interested in early Christianity. Once again, I mentioned that one of the things that Herod was doing is making this grand temple. He made sure to make it a Jewish temple. There's no iconography on it. There's nothing offensive to Jews, and it was surrounded in the first century by him and by people who built later with massive pools, presumably designed for ritual bathing. And the Pool of Siloam is one of those. Extremely large pool would have accommodated a massive amount of people. The other most notable one is the pool to the north of that by the Church of Saint Anne. And that's the Pool of Bethesda. And the Gospels tell an interesting story. The Gospel of John does, about how when the water would bubble up, it was presumed that may be an angel or something spiritual, that the first person to get in there would be healed. It looks very much like there was a series of sluices that brought water in from elsewhere, and that from underground would bring water in on occasion to make sure that the pool was filled. So it seems not to have been an angel or a spirit or anything with healing power, but it probably was good old Roman engineering and some sluice system that would keep the water full, and may even have kept the water clean and moving in and out. But these are, in my opinion, fascinating discoveries that really kind of bring to life the New Testament, the Gospels, but they kind of, in my opinion, cast a bit more secular shadow on how the ancients thought of things.
Can you tell us about the Pool of Bethesda and the Gospel of John mentioning it?
Yeah. And maybe we edit this, but that was, I'm sorry if I wasn't clear, that was the pool that I just mentioned with the
Okay.
sluices.
Okay. What were Herod's building projects?
Yeah, Herod the Great was the master builder of the ancient world. He built not only the temple, which was one of the largest Temple Mounts projects in the ancient world. But he also built a series of other buildings, building projects. Notably, early on in his reign, he built some temples dedicated to Caesar Augustus in places like Caesarea Philippi, named after Caesar. He built also a temple and did projects in the central Israelite town of Sebaste. Sebaste means in honor of Augustus, the honored one. He built a series of private palace fortresses like the Herodian, where he was probably buried, like Masada, where the famed battle against the Romans took place by the Zealots or Jews opposing Roman rule. And then a massive palace in Jericho has also been discovered. All of these show incredible wealth. They show his penchant for Roman engineering, combining Roman engineering with some Eastern styles to give it kind of a more local flair as well. And I'd say probably the crown jewel of his achievements was maybe not the temple, but the entire city of Caesarea Maritima on the coast. And that, of course, had not just Roman architecture. It had a temple in it. It had a port that was built that was incredible engineering for its time, made it one of the largest ports in the Eastern Mediterranean. It also had a theater and a place for horse racing, and of course a palace for himself. But what was important about that city is it showed that Herod the Great was interested in linking up his kingdom with the broader Mediterranean world and connecting it with Rome and bringing Rome to his land and allowing his people to go to other lands and be part of the massive exchange that was happening on the Mediterranean world.
What about the Pool of Bethesda in relation to the Gospel of John?
Okay. So the Pool of Bethesda was located to the north of the Temple Mount in a church of St. Anne. It's been worked on for decades now, if not centuries, by Catholic friars and priests. And it shows in really interesting set of sluices and vehicles to bring in water to keep the pool full, and it would have bubbled up at various times as the sluices were activated. And of course, the Gospel of John talks about that. People who were in need of healing would sit there, wait for the bubbles to come, believing that there may be an angel, and would try to jump in and be the first one in, and then get healed. But it seems to have just been a basic Roman engineering and much less an angel of healing.
Who is the other Son of God?
That's a great question. That's actually one of the things I like to start off with my students is I start talking to them about the Son of God and in the first century BCE, and then about a third of the way through they realize I'm not really describing Jesus, but I'm describing the Emperor Augustus Octavian, who claimed to be a son of God. It's actually an incredible story. The Emperor Octavian was young, the adopted son of Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was murdered on the Senate floor. And instead of, cutting and running, Octavian walked around and said, okay, I'm in charge now. I'm his legal heir. And the comet was in the sky. And so he said, that comet, that is my father. And if he's having an apotheosis or a resurrection or an ascension into heaven, and Julius Caesar is now God, then, well, I'm the son of God. And so that was something, Divi Filios, or Di son of a god, that he put on all of his coins. And it was not only on all of his coins, it was everywhere in the Roman world. He put it on temples, he put it on inscriptions, it was communicated through statues, it was communicated in all kinds of ways to everyone. And knew it. They got it, that he ruled by divine right, and he himself was divine. So, it's always a shock to my students that the Christians weren't the first by a long shot. This goes way back to Alexander and back to the Babylonians before that, to proclaim that a human was in fact a god.
Do Matthew, Mark, and Luke's Gospel statements about give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's connected to Emperor Octavian being the other son of
Oh,
God?
absolutely. I think for me, pound for pound, in terms of the archaeology, word for word, in terms of the texts, that's one of the most illustrative passages in the gospel if you want to understand early Christianity and Jesus. So the interesting thing about that passage is that if you read it carefully, Jesus says, "Go get me a coin." So he's presuming that every single coin that could be gotten will be the same. And in fact, archaeology shows that every single coin at that time would have the emperor's image on it and would almost always also have an inscription proclaiming the emperor, whether it's Augustus, Tiberius, or later emperors, as a divi filius, a son of a god. So it's a great illustration that this propaganda of the divine Caesars was everywhere. Clearly the case. He just has to say, "Go grab a coin." They grab it. The other interesting thing to me about the passage is it shows that Jesus. I don't think Jesus is making a theological statement about separation of church and state, as has been claimed in more recent centuries. But I think what he's doing is he's evading the trap. And the trap, of course, is if he says, the question is, should we pay taxes? He says, "Go get me a coin. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar. Render to God the things that are God." He's flipping the question on its head, and he's really asking, what if Caesar claims to be God? And that kind of undermines what they're trying to do, which is trap him. If he says pay taxes, the people aren't happy. If he says don't pay taxes, the Romans aren't happy, and he could face arrest. So he takes the question, flips it a little bit with the common vernacular of coinage of his day, and slips away as they probably look quite befuddled. I think it's not a theological statement. I think it's really a kind of a early Christian description of how they perceive Jesus as remarkably clever and able to control situations.
Is there a link between 1 Thessalonians 5:3 when they say, "There is peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them," with Emperor Octavian?
Absolutely. It's not just Octavian, but it's all the Roman emperors who were claiming to be divine. One of the things that we see everywhere is proclamations not only of the Caesars as divine, but in particular Octavian and Augustus as the bringer of the peace, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. And it's often not called the Roman peace, Pax Romana. It's the Augustan peace. It's the peace that Augustus brought. And so when you look at First Thessalonians and the quote there that said, where Paul says, "When they say peace and security, sudden destruction will come upon them." In my mind, it's a clear challenge to the status quo of Rome that Rome has brought peace. In Paul's apocalyptic view and the early Christian apocalyptic view, this is not a lasting peace. Jesus is going to come back soon, and everything's going to be overturned, even the peace that was brought by the Romans. There's a fascinating altar that's been found in south of Rome, and I can try to give that a quick share
Okay.
as well. But if you
I
take a
see
look
it.
at it, what does it have there at the top? Paci August Sacrum, sacred to the Augustan peace. So this is an altar you would sacrifice things on, sacred to the peace. And then, of course, the other item that you have next to it is an altar sacred to the Augustan security. And you see at the top, they are securitas, right? So you have these two altars, um, sacred to the Augustan peace, sacred to the Augustan security, peace and security. Peace and security is a watchword that we see throughout literature and in some inscriptions. And so I think it's clear to me that what Paul is doing is challenging the Roman world order and the perception that a true peace has been brought. And he and other Christians are anticipating some kind of apocalypse.
What is the archaeological context for Paul's life, and what were the main dangers of his travels?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think, I mean, first of all, in the modern world, we love to think about travel, and it's exciting and it's thrilling, and you get to see new places. Travel in the ancient world was dangerous. In fact, travel by ship was extremely dangerous, and kind of sailing shut down sort of November through March. And even October, September could be dangerous because of the winds, or April, May could be dangerous as well. And there's an incredible number of shipwrecks that have been discovered, many of them along the coast of Turkey, where massive excavations, maritime excavations have taken place and discovered some of these. So we know that shipwrecks from the Bronze Age through the Roman period, through the Byzantine period, were always happening. And of course, if you're going from the land of Israel, the province of Syria, the cities that Paul went to along the coast of Turkey and then over into Greece, or even on his way to Rome to when he was imprisoned, this was a dangerous undertaking. And people who dabbled in trade were thought to be fools. The rich in the Roman world invested basically in agriculture and land. Investing in trade was kind of fool's gold. You didn't do it because the shipwreck could ruin you, and there were lots of shipwrecks. So travel in the ancient world, I think, would have been a very dangerous enterprise. Travel on land would have been dangerous. The cities were mostly secure, villages probably, but in between, brigands, bandits, wild animals, wolves, maybe even, according to some stories. So it'd be a pretty dangerous undertaking.
What do we know about Paul's assemblies? Has archaeological evidence ever been found for assemblies, and do we even know what they look like?
Well, I think when you talk about the first and second century, you're asking the $1,000,000 question, Jacob. I think that's probably, to me, the key question to try to figure out early Christianity and how it really gets going and how it gets up off the ground. I would put the question this way: we don't really know. It seems like from Paul's letters, which might only be one slice, that they're meeting in houses, maybe in the triclinium or the dining area, where there's a ranking of people. That could be one model. We know some of the earliest churches, for example, a church in Dura Europos was a house church. That's over in the Syrian desert area, a home converted into a church, which is simply a large room where an assembly was held and a small baptismal nearby. So it may have started in a house. The site at Capernaum, so-called St. Peter's house, we know as early possibly as the second century. The house was used, the floor was plastered. There's some graffiti there by the second century, probably used as something like a house church. But there's other evidence in Rome that associates the meetings more with funerary cults, and they're around cemeteries or the catacombs or where people are buried. And so maybe Christianity in that part of the world arose more. What would we call it? A cult of the dead. I'm not sure. It's really fascinating to me to think about. What's going on at these meetings? Where are they? How frequent are they? How many people are there? And we just don't know. I think the best guesses we have are from the scholar John Kloppenborg, who's written the book Christ's Associates, collects a massive amount of evidence to begin to look at what did meetings look like, what did religious meetings look like. To me, I think the one thing is clear that the synagogue model kind of gets abandoned early on, late first century maybe. Um, are they looking at a Mithraeum, which was a very popular, we'll call it a mystery cult or mystery religion, often underground, that would meet? These are small, tiny, maybe you're only meeting 15, 20, at most 25 people meeting in these. Maybe that's an analogy. Maybe also in houses you have buildings called the Augustales, which were dedicated to the divine Augustan heritage, and were a way for lower class people to gain status. Jacob, I wish we knew. I wish we had some late first century structures that said Paul and his guys met here, or Peter met here. We don't have it, so we are. And I think I'll use this with some humility, and I don't intend disrespect to the discipline, but we're just making a lot of stuff up in our imaginations about what's going on in the late first, early second century, and until like the third century, when we can really see some things happening. I don't have a good idea about that. I think the one thing we can say for sure is they were private. They weren't public. I think the other thing the other kind of question I can ask is, if it's private, what did leadership look like? If it wasn't a home, was the homeowner the most important person? Paul seems to fight against that. But it may have been the natural tendency, and it may have been what's happening, and that's precisely why Paul is fighting about it. But that's a great question, and I frankly think because Christians were probably so indistinguishable from other groups or normative groups in the Roman Empire, I don't think there's probably a clear discovery to be had until maybe late second, third century, when we start getting lots of stuff. That's a great question, though, Jacob.
When Paul says in Galatians 6:11, "See what large letters I make when I am writing in my own hand," what does the discoveries of codices at Nag Hammadi and the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls tell us about how writing was done in the ancient world, and does it help us understand Paul at all?
Absolutely. That again is one of my favorite verses. He's so mad. He's going to take the pen himself and write it down. But it's really clear that his writing is not nearly as neat, as small, as articulate as a professional scribe. So that little piece, and there's a few others, clearly indicates that Paul's letters adhered to the basic style and system of writing in the ancient world, which was scribal. Even though I think Paul was literate, he probably wasn't very good at writing. He could read, I'm sure, absolutely, but he probably wasn't writing a lot himself. That was done by scribes. And so all of these discoveries that we have, I think the most important are probably from Oxyrhynchus, a place in Egypt, where some Christian fragments have been found. But they teach us that writing was done by professional scribes, that professional scribes probably had templates that they used, so that when you went to a scribe and asked them to write a letter, they'd kind of tell you, okay, we're going to start with the introduction. We're going to start, then we're going to move to this. Then we're going to have a prayer. Then we're going to have the body. Then we're going to have the goodbyes. What do you want to say? And I think it's likely then that the scribes may have had some influence on Paul, that he's just not, it's not like a 1960s, 70s scene of the boss kicking up his feet in the office and dictating, and a secretary is there, is doing it word for word, and he's asking, okay, let me edit that. But there's probably a little bit more interaction going on, especially with format, maybe with word choice, maybe with some stylistic issues, maybe even with some theological issues. And there's this wonderful book, I don't know if you've read it, by Candida Moss, on God's ghostwriters, that talks about the scribal class being heavily enslaved people. And so might there have been even we'll call it theological influence, ideological influence on Paul and other early Christian writing? It's a fascinating question, and I know it's a book that's gotten some criticism because she can't prove her case. But I tell students our discipline is based on the possible, the plausible, the probable, and the provable, and nothing's ever provable. So she hasn't proven her case, of course not, but she makes it probable, if not plausible. And I think the archaeology, the inscriptions, all of the papyri lend to her case, and I think she's done the best job of using that archaeology, using the writings of the ancient world to try to understand scribes and their impact on what finally gets written.
Does the Sergius Paulus inscription validate Acts as history?
Well, I don't think so. It's a great question. You have this person, Sergus Palus, who's mentioned in the Book of Acts. He's located in Turkey, city in Antioch. He's someone in Acts, and sure enough, there's excavations there that have found an inscription of him. He was a city official. He's described a city official, and so once again, I think there probably was somebody by that name. I would connect it to the same person mentioned in the book of Acts. I think for some people that's exciting, especially of the Christian faith. For me, it's interesting because it shows there's a connection with reality, which makes archaeology very important. But I think to build on that, therefore, that the book of Acts is true, to put it that way, or that the truth claims of the book of Acts have just been verified. I have no doubt many, if not all, of the characters in Acts are, real-ish or refer to people from memory. So that's no surprise at all. You can say the same thing about, there's an Erastus who's mentioned in one of Paul's letters to the Romans. And we have an inscription in Corinth of an Erastus who's a city official. It's not an uncommon name, but it's possible that Erastus is the same fellow that is mentioned in Paul's letters to the Romans. But then again, I'll hammer home the same question. Doesn't really mean that Paul's point in Romans that we're saved by grace, not works, is true. Just kind of means that Paul wasn't a fabricated, or Erastus and Paul weren't people fabricated in the 2nd, 3rd century, which again, some people do believe, but not me.
I want to ask about the tomb of Flavia Domitilla. It's some people think it's a 1st century. They connect it to a particular person called Clement, mentioned by Paul in his letter to the Philippians.
Yeah, I'm gonna say there's what I said earlier about things are possible. It's possible.
Mm-hmm.
Is it plausible? You're on thin ice. Is it probable? Wow. You're going to need convincing. Is it provable? Absolutely not. Even the people that make the case, they know it's speculation. It's actually that and the other things I've mentioned, Erastus, Sergius Paulus, get to an interesting phenomenon among more conservative Christians, not so more progressive Christians, who are really desperate to find something to hang on to that validates their faith. And, I just, even if I concede all of those as provable, I don't see how that validates, I don't see how it validates your faith.
Is the iconography in that tomb, does that really date to the end of the 1st century, beginning 2nd, or is it much later than that?
I'm not an expert in that iconography, but most people date it to later. In fact, most people would say that Christian iconography doesn't really start until later 2nd century. There's a really important book, in my opinion, called Ante Pacem. Graydon Snyder, I believe, is the author, and he clearly shows that iconography doesn't really appear until 3 generations, 120 years after kind of the emergence of the first Christians. And that's actually an important observation, because if you look at other social movements or religious movements, Buddhism is a great example, and others, iconography doesn't develop in religious movements until kind of that third, or more likely the fourth generation of followers. Um, and especially within Christianity, which was so apocalyptic, there's not much interest, I don't think, in developing an iconography. So I would again, I would concede it as possible. And what that means is I can't 100% disprove it. I think people who have studied iconography more than I have would probably say it's totally improbable. Um, but I wouldn't claim to be an expert on that, on that topic.
What was the defining event in early Christian history?
Well, I think from the archaeological record, I think I give you the following answer. Of course, you could argue it's Jesus, it's Paul. It's when Paul writes his letters. It's when the Gospels get written. Um, but I think maybe, to me, the two most defining moments are in the 3rd century, when Christianity gets persecuted. The Decius and Domitian persecutions in the later 3rd century mark a point when Christianity gets put on a larger stage, and people are seeing it. For the hundreds of years up to that, I'm sure they're proselytizing. I'm sure they're giving to the poor. They're trying really hard. But it just, all the archaeological evidence doesn't look like there's that many Christians. I mean, I sometimes throw out to my students, it was less than 1% of the entire Roman Empire. Kind of making that up, but the fact is, we know of so few sites and places, and the Christian literature itself from that period clearly portrays itself as a minority. So I think when you get put on the stage, when you get executed, that caught the attention of people, and people started talking about it. The second probable and likely most important moment is when Constantine the Great, probably with heavy influence from his mother in the 4th century, legalizes Christianity. Doesn't make the empire Christian, but he legalizes Christianity, and he pours cash into the church, and they start, Bibles suddenly appear that are made out of vellum and parchment and materials that last. They're beautiful, high quality, expensive books. By the way, that's also when finally the question of canon, what's in, what's out, what order gets finalized. He pours money into churches, and the basilica, the imperial building, becomes the structure, which totally changes from the house church or the catacombs. It's a public building with everything focused on the front. The priest, the bishop, the sacraments, whatever's the official is doing, rather than kind of a shared building. And he tries to get the church to straighten out the theology. And this is not my area. I'm more of an archaeologist, more biblical scholar from New Testament periods. But I've always suspected that the key question he had of the church and of the theologians and bishops was, tell me about Jesus' identity, and how can Jesus be both fully human and fully divine? I've always suspected he's not really asking about Jesus. He's asking about himself as emperor, because some of his coins do depict him as Sol Invictus, as divine. So even though he gets credit for legalizing Christianity, he seems to continue the long-held view that the emperor was divine or backed by divinity.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Jonathan Reed.
Great. Appreciate it. Thank you.
I just want to remind everybody, the link to purchase the book will be in the description below and in the pinned comment. And with that being said, thank you once again. Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.